welcome to Stand Up Upstate. Today's episode is going to be about domestic violence. So we are going to interview Michelle Gilbert, the Director of Housing and Authority at Safe Harbor. And so we'll get right to that, and we'll see you back afterwards as we discuss what we felt and thought about the interview.
My name is Michelle Gilbert, and I work at Safe Harbor. We're an upstate domestic violence agency, and I currently serve as the Director of Advocacy, Education, and Housing.
Okay. And what does Safe Harbor do?
Safe Harbor offers a myriad of different programs. In the area of prevention, we spend a lot of times. We spend a lot of time in schools, really
Okay.
talking about dating violence prevention, right? Because we know
Oh.
that being able to establish healthy relationships is important. And the
Mhm.
earlier we're able to do that, the easier it is to counteract, things like domestic
Mhm.
abuse. So with our relationship education program, we take on a train the teacher model. So it's basically where we actually train those that are in the schools, on the dating violence, curriculum and how to facilitate healthy conversations with young people. We serve a little over 5,000 youth, every year through that
Wow.
program, right, throughout our service
Yeah.
area in Greenville, Anderson, Oconee, and Pickens. So we're very grateful to be able to have that conversation and collaboration with our schools. That's also offered with youth groups and community groups as well. And then, of course, in the area of intervention, which is probably what we're best known for, as our shelters. We have three shelters in Greenville, Anderson, and Oconee, but we also serve Pickens County. They are
Okay.
emergency shelters. So many of the folks coming into that particular program are coming in with just the clothing on their back. They're fleeing, domestic abuse, and it's a safe place to not only begin the process, of healing, but really think about what's next while getting some supportive resources. We also offer, a housing program where we're able to provide some financial assistance. We do a lot of community outreach, and then we have a community services clinical program where survivors are able to get therapy, and we also are able to offer services, to families, including children.
Okay. Um, Now what about the after? So you have prevention, which is educating before. You have the intervention while it's going on. So what about after? After, let's say I am a domestic violence victim and I've gone through the services. I would imagine that I'm still living with a lot. It doesn't just go away once I make it through, once I find housing, once I become stable. So do you?
Absolutely. We know that
Yeah.
leaving is only one part, right? And
Mhm.
while it's oftentimes the most difficult part, it's only one factor. And so that
Yeah.
is where our community services, program comes in.
Mhm.
So we're
Okay.
able to offer, the clinical therapy, advocacy, and additional support in that way. And
Okay.
also, of course, with our housing programs, if you're a part of that program, then you also have a case manager who works with you, on goals and just different things, of that nature, just depending upon what the needs are.
Okay. So when let's go back to prevention really quickly, because you're doing this in schools. How long have you been doing it in school, coming into the schools and educating teachers and teenagers about domestic violence?
Well over a decade. Initially we
Okay.
really started off in working, with high schools. But what the data has shown us is that oftentimes the first incident, of domestic abuse generally occurs in, or dating violence usually
Hmm.
occurs in middle school, right? So if we're waiting
Cool.
until high school to have the conversation, then we've already missed the mark. So within the last few years, we've really altered, our target audience to middle school again, to talk about healthy relationships, even friendships. Those
Yeah.
are our first relationships, right? But they oftentimes
Yep.
set the course of what our adult relationships will look like, as well. So, really having that conversation, in an open, supportive, but evidence-based way.
Do we have evidence that shows that this is actually helpful and this is working, or do we need to even attack it at an earlier age?
Absolutely. So I cannot speak for every program, but our program,
Yeah.
we have some very strong, findings. One, everything that we do is evidence-based. So it's just not something that we're pulling out of the hat, right? So we spend a lot of time researching our curriculum. They also meet our state standards, in terms of talking about, not only sexual violence, but dating violence, as well. So we're covered on those areas. But at the beginning of our program, there is a pre-survey and then there's a post-survey. What our data has showed us is that students are able to recognize the signs of a healthy and unhealthy relationship at a much greater rate than they were prior, to the training.
Mhm.
They are also able to identify a supportive person, to be able to talk to, if these situations occur. They're also able to identify behaviors that could lead, to dating violence. So that is very encouraging. But you're right, we still need to do more, right? And so
Mhm.
we recently developed an elementary school curriculum, and it really is more about formative relationships and what makes a good friend, and what happens, when a friend makes you upset. What are some of the things that you can do? So while it's not necessarily geared at dating violence, it's geared at building healthy relationships. And that's what it's about, for us, right? Oftentimes people get in unhealthy relationships because they have no picture of what healthy looks like. And so the more that we can talk about that at an early age, the more that we can put community helpers in place, the more we're going to be able to change the outcomes in South Carolina.
Yeah, that was really surprising to me to read how we've actually been in the top 10 for like 20 to 25 years. Not something you want to be in the top 10 for.
Absolutely. And I think, there are a lot of things, that can point to why, that has happened.
Okay.
There's no secret that there's a correlation between states that have, higher incidents of deaths due to domestic violence and weaker gun laws, right? And so South Carolina certainly has a lack of, gun laws. And regardless of what side of the spectrum you sit on, a reality is we know that handguns are often used in domestic violence, deaths, right? So if there's not a presence of a handgun, that significantly reduces, the incidence,
Yeah.
death. And then also, the reality of just domestic violence legislation and laws, we are certainly behind the curve. We've not had any major um, ramifications in the law since the Governor Haley's, administration. And then prior
Okay.
to that, it had been decades. So, our laws, oftentimes don't correlate to what's going on, in our community. And then resources are limited with all the things that we do, at Safe Harbor and that our sister agencies do across the state. It's still not enough. We have more animal shelters in South Carolina than we do domestic violence shelters, but we rank in the top 10 for women killed by men due to domestic abuse.
Yeah, that's really sad.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's really sad.
But
Um,
we can change that. There are things
yeah,
that we can do to make it better. And no one should be comfortable with those statistics in the state. The good news is
yeah.
that we have some legislation right now
Mhm.
that is in our state house, and it has been, for a while.
Okay.
But it is certainly one of our priorities, for the year in terms of advocating for. But with the passage, of that particular bill, it would extend eligibility for orders or protections to both teens and adult victims of dating violence.
Okay.
So there's
Um,
certainly an opportunity to do some advocacy and, call your elected officials, and really push this bill. It's ridiculous that we don't have
yeah.
this. It makes absolutely no sense.
Is it an order of protection? What is that?
So, an order of protection, it's a legal order that provides some protections for those that have experienced domestic abuse. And so, those protections can include that the person causing harm cannot be within a certain vicinity, of you as well, right? That includes your workplace. It may include, your home, different things of that nature. And then it holds them accountable. So, if they're reaching out, contacting you by phone, or proximity, driving by your house, they can actually be arrested or face, legal, consequences for that.
Okay. Yeah. I'm I don't know if everybody knows what these things are when we talk about them. I
Mhm.
think sometimes we have an idea, but we don't really know legally what that means and how much they're held accountable on that end. Um,
Absolutely. And the beautiful thing about order protection is that even if you relocate, your order protection and is still good. So if you're in South Carolina and you move to North Carolina, that person just cannot walk in, on your job. Or if they're in Walmart and you're in Walmart, you can show that and they have to leave, or again, just they can just be held legally accountable. And certainly those dating partners can get a restraining order, but restraining
mhm.
orders are given in magistrate court, so they just do not carry the same level of penalties that an order of protection would carry. But what I will say, that order of protections have been vital, in helping to save lives and providing, protections, to victims in various ways. But we have we have some ways to go in strengthening, laws.
Okay.
And
Um,
also, too, you also have
yeah.
to make sure that we do our due diligence in safety planning. I think oftentimes we want to tell people, get an order of protection, just leave. But leaving is oftentimes the most dangerous time, for someone experiencing domestic abuse. So it's not as simple as just going to court and signing up for an order of protection. It's a legal matter. And so you've got to weigh out the consequences of that. And survivors know their partners better than anyone else. So they know how to predict behavior patterns, and things of that nature. So being able to have that conversation, to be able to make the decision that is not only safest, for the survivor, but is also most informed. So really weighing out, the advantages or disadvantages, of an order of protection or any legal order, and understanding the full limitations and what's required of them, right? Even simple things like making sure your order protection is in your possession, giving a copy of that to your landlord or to your kiddo's school, keeping it in your car, things of that nature, because just saying you have an order protection isn't going to get you far, but being able to have that, in your possession oftentimes can make a difference.
And I read that it takes a woman 7 times before she leaves um, her domestic violence, that partner who is abusing her. Why does it take so long? Do we know? And like you did comment that that is the most dangerous time for her is when she's
Mhm.
leaving. To leave and to do that, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking to get up that courage to do it the first time has to be terrifying. Um,
Mhm.
and if you don't fully leave, there are probably repercussions for that. So to continue to try and try, why does it take so long, or what, or many times? Is it the lack of resources? Is it, what is it that is keeping them from leaving sooner or being successful at leaving sooner?
I think, and that's on average, right? So for some
Yeah,
survivors,
that's an
it's more than
average.
that, from some survivors, it's less, but that is the average. And so what I'll say first is, and I think this is the bigger, answer. I think a society that continues to ask, why doesn't a survivor leave versus asking, why does a person hit? That is at the
Mm,
root, of the issue, right? And oftentimes it's the victimization of survivors even beyond, the domestic abuse. And that often, attributes, to that. Leave and go where? Like I said, there are more animal shelters than there are domestic violence shelters. So if you're fortunate enough to be able to get a bed in a domestic abuse shelter, right, then what? What happens? Your average stay is about 60 days. And even with, the chance, for an extension and even having, supportive services, imagine resetting your life, in 60 days. And what does that look like? And if you've not had an opportunity to work or even access basic things like education or transportation, where do you start, right? And then you talk about
mm,
like affordability, the average rent cost right here, in Greenville, is outrageous. And so you're thinking about hitting restart, finding affordable, safe housing that is oftentimes accessible to transportation is a barrier, all within itself, and then if you have children, involved, what happens? Because there's no time to get it together together when you also have kids. And the statistics indicate that those that cause harm are more likely to get custody of the children, not because they're better parents or not because survivors are not equipped to raise them, but oftentimes they have the support and they have the resources, they have the ability to provide. So, am I going to risk losing my child, or do I go back where my child has some level, of stability, and I take the chance of, whatever, because we're all together, right? So there's that. Or people say, oh, well, you can just get a job, you can find a job. And you're right. People are hiring on every corner, but affordable wages is a whole nother issue, right? So even if
Yep.
I get a job and it's not an affordable wage and I'm not able to access, childcare, and I cannot pay for the place that I'm living in, do I really have an option, right? So oftentimes we're asking survivors to make options where all outcomes seem dark. So you think about, all
Mhm.
of those things. And then you think about that in the midst of trying to restart, your life, you're also carrying oftentimes the physical, mental, and emotional scars of an abusive relationship that has told you that you are worthless, that you cannot do this, without, a person. And so when your confidence has oftentimes been swayed, in such a way, you begin to believe that. Growing up, I remember the statement, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That is such a lie. Words break us many times, and many times we regurgitate what has been put inside of us, right? So
Yeah.
without access to, those supportive services, that becomes very difficult. And even if you're lucky enough to be able to get a counselor, or you're able to get, some mental health support for everything that you've gone to, you also got to go to work. You got to pay the bills. You're juggling kids. And so, like, when is there time, and consistency to do that? And then oftentimes you're also navigating a legal system that says, yes, you've been harmed, but you still need to be able to have contact with this person because you have kids, in contact, or maybe you don't have kids, but you didn't qualify for an order of protection because there was no physical abuse. So we also live in a community or a system that says it's got to be at the worst before it reaches the statute of the law, right? And so by the time you get to that point, there have been so many losses. So even leaving feels like another loss. So I've traded, one bad situation oftentimes for another situation. And even if you're, like I said, fortunate enough to find shelter and find supportive resources, what if you lived with that person and both of your names were on the lease, right? So now you've
Mhm.
left. That person decides, I'm not going to pay the rent. So now you've got an eviction. In South Carolina, we have some of the worst, eviction laws also in our state. We know 40% of survivors of domestic abuse are more likely to face homelessness. So then what do you do with that? Because now I got this on my record, as well. So when you think about all of those different factors, and then at the core of domestic abuse, what we talked about is that power and control and that isolation and lack of support. So I've been cut off from my resources and family and friends. Where do I go? What happens
Yeah.
next?
Okay. And then I see there's one, this is H4. I think it's a 9. I can't read my writing. 27, so correct me if I'm wrong. And if not, we'll correct it in the comments below when we post this. That talks about creating a database for repeat abusers. How would this work? I mean, do you have an idea of how this would work, and how helpful would it actually be?
And that is something that has been, debated, and there are lots of, thoughts, upon what that looks like, very similar to what you see among sexual predators. And so you'd have, domestic violence, predators. Um, I don't know. Certainly, I think anything that strengthens, survivors' access to services, is a benefit. But I struggle with the implementation of what, that looks like. And when I think about, most people, when you get in a relationship, you're not necessarily always running them through, the database. So certainly not saying that it's not, strong legislation, but I do think that there are, some other things that are out there that could be most helpful from what I've seen, as a service provider. Again, S702, expanding the definition of domestic violence. Also, S143, what I alluded to earlier, which would
Mhm.
extend eligibility for orders of protections for both teen and adult victims of dating violence. And then also H3539, which gives a protected status for victims of domestic abuse and their ability to terminate a lease early in specified
Okay.
circumstances, which would really help, with some of the housing. And I also think, and I don't know the specific bill number, but what we're doing with sexual assault and rape kits is just ridiculous. The backlogs and really evidence not getting processed or put through, a centralized system, not only in a systematic way, but in a way that really strengthens, outcomes and accountability, for offenders. We are way behind the course, in South Carolina.
Mhm.
So certainly I think all of those things would be very helpful to prioritize.
So if I'm a victim of domestic violence, what are some of the first steps I'm looking to take if I'm wanting to start to plan to leave? Where are some of the first places I can go? I mean, our listeners may actually be experiencing that themselves. So what's one of the first steps we can take when if we find ourselves in that situation?
So I think knowledge is power, right? And so I think the internet is one of our greatest tools, right? So going to websites, like ours can oftentimes be very helpful. That's at safeharborsc.org. Certainly SCADVASA, which is the South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, looking at NEDV, which is the National Network to End Domestic Violence. There are a plethora of resources from physically leaving to indicators of domestic abuse to technology abuse and, what that looks like and what are some safeguards, that you can put into place. They also offer, the opportunity for quick exits if someone walks in the room or like how to erase, your browser or browsing history, just again to safety plan. Also reaching out, to agencies like ours. We have a 24/7 hotline. Not only is it a pathway to be able to access, immediate services, but we're also available to safety plan, to offer, emotional support. Many times it's also talking with a trusted, person in your life, whether that's a medical provider or if that's a friend, or someone within a faith-based community that's going to help you brainstorm your next options. And then what I'd also like to highlight is that survivors are the experts of their life. I've spent a lot of time in school learning about this work. I've spent a lot of time with survivors. And what I have gathered, and I think in what the data shows, is that survivors have been navigating their life, long before they came into our programs or reached out for resources. So I'd also say, like, trust your gut, and thinking about what your next is and what safety looks like for you. And that step for someone may be packing up tonight, and leaving. For someone else, it may be stashing $5 or $10 back, every week until I'm able to gather resources or getting birth certificates or making copies, of my driver's license or creating an incident log, of what's, going on or, having a conversation, with a neighbor to be like, hey, in case of an emergency, or if you notice this, this is what I need for you to do or whatnot. So trust your gut, but also know that there is an array of resources to be able to help you navigate. And sometimes we have to pivot, right? We can plan and we can have a path forward, and things will pop up and they will happen unexpectedly. We often tell our survivors that that is a part of life, but that does not mean that you cannot keep going forward. So just being open and giving yourself grace as well.
And do you guys help survivors of sexual assault as well? Is that something most domestic violence groups also help with both?
So we do serve survivors of sexual assault that have experienced a sexual assault within the domestic abuse, right? So if it's a partner that you know, we are able to help. If it is, someone that's assaulted you that you're not familiar with, or you really don't have any connections, then Julie Valentine Center is a wonderful resource. We are both member agencies of the South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. So, of course, we work very closely together, but they really take the lead, for those types of victims. So it's a continuum of services. It's not uncommon that some DV agencies also are partnered with a sexual assault agency and they have a CDC. We are not that at Safe Harbor, but we do have a wonderful partner here in Greenville.
We're really grateful for places like yours and others in the community that are doing what is necessary. But we definitely need to educate more. You're right. We don't talk about it enough, and you don't know what you don't know.
Absolutely. But when you do, you have to do something about it.
Yes. Yes, you do. Thank you so much, Michelle. It was really great talking to you. I really
Yeah, me
appreciate you
too.
taking the time.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this platform and the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you.
The interview.
Uh, Honestly, she was pretty incredible. So very thorough, so very knowledgeable, and once again, so informative. The biggest takeaway. It's interesting. Um, the topic stand up upstate is covered. There is a common thread, which is that we do not have enough social services. After watching this interview, one of the things is why don't women leave? Which we know is the wrong question. Yes. But one of the answers being to go where?
Yeah.
And it's the same problem for a lot of people. We don't have enough wheres to go.
Yeah.
We don't have enough. And then the other thing, I'm an animal rights activist, and hearing her say we have more shelters for animals, which, we don't have enough shelters for animals.
No, we don't.
We have more for animals than we have for people. That's just totally unacceptable to me. And then again, South Carolina making the list, making yet another great list. We were, I think, for a number of years, number 10.
We were for 20 to 25 years. We were in the top 10. Yeah.
And now we're 11.
Yeah.
So that's not that much better.
No, but it's not.
I mean, I have been donating to Safe Harbor for years now without really knowing fully what takes place and just how much is needed.
Yeah, and they're building another, they're about to open another facility that will allow for housing, and she says it's still not enough.
That's just incredible. And then the other thing was going into middle schools.
Yeah.
I was thinking about myself in middle school. Not even a thought, but the things as simple as telling someone, you don't need your friends, we're all we need, and how that's a precursor was, just really mind-blowing to me.
Yeah.
The education is what we're lacking. And again, one of the things that came out was that we need to remove shame.
Yes.
And talk about it more. And I know you've got some more resources to list, and that's great, because I think any of us should be educated enough to be able to talk about things and answer questions for people where to go, and just make it part of our culture that we can talk about it so people don't feel the shame and feel they can reach out to other people.
Yeah. But it's something that she said, we talked about how there are precursors to it actually getting physical. You have all these things that happen.
Right.
And so by the time it gets physical, that shame's already creeped in, that you allowed yourself to be treated this way. You allowed it. You know what I mean? And we pile that on instead of, and blame ourselves, instead of blaming the actual perpetrator.
Right.
And so then we're in a shame spiral,
right.
And we feel stuck because a lot of times they're controlling other aspects of our lives when we're in those
That's right.
situations.
Right.
So then where, like you said, where do you
There you
go?
go.
And, abuse perpetuates itself over and over. So if you're a child who's witnessed
Right.
your parents
That's right.
being abusive,
That's right.
you don't know what a healthy relationship looks like. That is your normal. And even if you know it's not right, you're comfortable in that situation because you know how to deal with that.
Right.
You know how to exist in that.
That's right. That's a good thing that and that she did too. And that is, this is what I know.
Yeah.
I don't know what if I leave. What is out there? I don't know. And so it's just very complicated, and
It is.
why it's so prevalent. I think is the varying levels of complicated. Basically.
Well, and she talked about how if you have kids, there are even more complications.
Right.
Your
pets. Where are you going?
Pets, yeah.
Right.
I mean, you're a victim, and you're the one who has to do all the stuff. You're the one who has to seek out help. You're the one who has to uproot your life. You're the one who feels like you're being punished again.
Right.
And look, you're already in home.
Right.
Yeah, you're leaving your comfort, your home, and now you have extra stress and extra worry.
How do we flip the script?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, other than holding men more accountable or women who are abusing, because men do get abused as well. While it's a lower percentage, and definitely we need to talk about that as well, because men face shame too.
Right.
And that goes with even with sexual assault survivors. Women, yes, while we predominantly are the ones who are assaulted, and we do carry that shame. We know what that's like. Men carry it even more so because they are supposed to be strong, and that's what culture tells them.
Right.
So that is additional shame on top of that.
I think shame is the operative word.
Yeah.
We need to start tilting our society from shame.
Yeah.
Shame drives so many
and we're shaming
people from getting help or doing the things that they should. It's absolutely true.
Yeah. So very sad, very hard to hear.
And also very educational, a lot to glean. So where else did you find that women?
I had heard of Mary's house.
Okay.
I'm not even sure where that had come up in conversation. But if you're down in the Pickens County area, there's also the Pickens County Advocacy Center. It's a 24-hour crisis hotline.
Oh, that's amazing.
For sexual assault survivors. Now, I was aware of that one.
Okay.
I had thought actually about volunteering there last year. I had met people there. And then there's the Julie Valentine Center in Greenville.
Yes.
So, which I believe she mentioned. Valentine. Oh, I did write that down wrong. It is Valentine. Sorry, folks. Correction.
Yes.
That's Julie Valentine Center in Greenville. Yeah, clearly I can't read my own writing today. But so there are other resources out there. It's just getting them out there so people know, people are aware. But again, we're still asking these victims to do the work when they already feel alone. And
do you have the crises?
I don't have the phone number written down, but we can put it in the show notes. Okay. And so we'll have that available for you. We'll actually have phone numbers for the hiding place in Mary's house as well. Okay. Because if you're looking to leave a domestic violence situation, you're going to want to give them a call. They're going to be able to talk to you and help you formulate a plan. And they're going to listen to you. You know your situation best. You know what's going to be safest for you. And they're just going to help you out with that and give you resources. And when you're ready, they'll be there for you. So,
thanks for watching.
Yeah, we appreciate it. We know it's a hard subject. If you guys have other resources that you're aware of, please list them in the comments.